from 102. The first, I'd say, 3 weeks are kind of a review of 102, but with some new stuff mixed into the review. So we will kind of focus in on, the new stuff. It's done for 2 reasons. First of all, many of you took 160 before coming into 140, and so you may be a little rusty with your 102 material. And secondly, it just usually helps to go back over some things again. Also, you're getting used to command line tools, so we want you to kind of also get into a rhythm with them. So we're going to start out actually very quickly with just a couple things with cout. So if you could either download this homework1.cpp or just copy and paste it into a file. And it would be good if you could start getting into the habit of using an editor like VI or Pico or whatever editor you choose to use, but please don't keep relying on using an IDE, because that's just not what we're using in this course. So please take a moment and, as I say, get that, download it into an appropriate directory. And then what I would like you to do is actually try compiling it yourself. Okay, so I have a directory that I call play. It just happens to be a place where I can kind of fool around with stuff. And I don't have it there yet, so I'm going to do it myself. And can someone remember what the compilation command is? What compilation command do I need to use in order to compile this? G++. And if I want to put it into a file named homework, what do I have to do? Minus O. Okay, so give that a whirl. It may take a moment for you, because usually the first time it is retrieving some stuff. And I'm just going to start randomly calling on people. I forgot to print out the homework or the roster today. So I'm just going to start with, actually Camille, I'll start with you. So how would you actually execute this?
Well, when I tried to, it said G++ command is not found.
Okay, so you need to use, you're probably going to have to download Xcode to make it. Okay. And someone actually, for Mac users, someone posted to Piazza and said how you can actually directly download the command line tools without getting Xcode. So you might want to look at Piazza, because it's a huge download. It's like 2.5 gigs. And if you're on a slow connection, or if you don't have a lot of memory, that's pretty huge. Yes?
Is this something we already have on the computers?
Yes, this is already, if you logged into Hydra, then you should be able to, the hw.cpp won't be there. You have to copy that from the notes using VI, okay? But G++ is there, okay? Let's see. Yep, yes you, what's your name? Alan, how would you execute this? What would you have to type in order to get to execute? Okay. Man in blue behind Alan. Yes.
You do the //
Very good. So // and then the file name. And that should cause the cout statement to print its output to the screen. If I just type HW, I get command not found. So does anyone know, because I'm not sure we went over it in lab, does anyone know what the // does? Yes?
It points to your current directory.
It points to your current directory. So it's a way of saying that we're executing something in our current directory. If I said instead .. slash, that would be a reference to my parent directory. Okay, so if I does anyone know how in Unix, so don't worry if you don't know, but these are commands you're going to have to get familiar with. That's why I'm going over them. Does anyone know the command that will show me what directory I am currently in? Yes. PWD stands for print working directory. So many Unix commands are mnemonic. So that shows me the directory that I'm currently in. Okay? If I want to change directories, the command is cd for change directory. And the ... says go to the parent directory. Okay, the directory one above this. So if I do that, and I again do a PWD, you can see that the difference right here, it is CS140 play. Up here, we've knocked off the play and it's just CS140. Okay, so when you are executing a program, you have to tell it which directory you're executing from, and that's why you have to say // and that's just a shorthand. You know how with texting you use shorthand? You could write it out completely, but that would be a total pain in the neck to have to always write out completely what the directory is. So that's why we have these shorthand notations. So it's good if you can just learn the shorthand notation. There's another shorthand notation. Does anyone know what it is for getting to a directory without having to go through /user/bvz? There's a shorthand for that as well that will take you directly. I'll take Mark. Tilde and your username. So if you say tilde, your username, okay, that is equivalent to writing users bvz. If you're on the Hydra machines, it will be home bvz. So that's shorthand. Tilde and your username is shorthand for either, if you're on a Windows box, then I'm not exactly sure. Someone who's on a Windows box running Cygwin. Anyone doing that right now? What did you get if you type PWD?
Well, I'm in the directory, just printed out /.
Pardon?
Just printed it out.
But I'm just curious, what directory? What was the name of?
Cygwin drive, so C.
So it was, okay, what was your Cygwin?
SCG drive.
SCG, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then what?
/C/users, and then wherever I'm at.
Something like that? Okay, so you'll
It's CYG drive.
okay, CYG drive. So if you're on in Cygwin, you might see something like that. Did it have a slash in front of it or not?
/ and no dash.
Okay. So you'll see something like that if you're on Windows. So each one kind of has a different kind of prefix for you. But again, this course is about learning Unix. You need to start learning what these shortcuts are because I will be using these shortcuts during class. And as you progress in your CS career, you will memorize these shortcuts. They are going to save you a considerable amount of time. Yes, Mark?
Do you have to put your username after the tilde? One of the default.
Let's see. So you just want me to say tilde, what? Maybe, I guess I've never tried it, Mark, any other way, so.
It should.
Tilde what? Tilde /?
Yeah.
Yep. So even the tilde. So you don't even need the BVZ. Just tilde / will do the trick. There's a trick I didn't know. Okay. Other questions about this? Yes.
Yeah,
when I type in /CS140 and I do have a directory, it says permission denied.
Okay. Alan. I'm going to have Alan kind of give you some.
So do you have to use? Are you trying to change something?
Yeah. So basically, Alan, come down here. I'll have Alan sometimes come around and help out with kind of real-time problems like that. Okay. So what I want y'all to do next, there's actually, if you scroll down a little bit in the notes, you'll see that there's actually two. Oh no, that's actually in the, okay, we'll get to that when we get to the output. So the other thing I just wanted to note is that many of you have seen exit somewhere, including in the first set of notes you were given. And you'll also note that we typically in 102 had you use return. There's a reason for it, it's subtle, okay? And as we get into the course, you will understand it better. But suffice it to say that exit was a command that was meant to help with abnormal termination of a program when there was a problem. And it was introduced in C. And it usually works. But it does have one issue, which is that it does not, just like you were taught about constructors in CS102, there are things called destructors associated with an object, like a string. And if you say, instead of return 0, you say exit 0, then exit does not execute the destructors for your certain declared objects, strings being one, vectors being others, and that's not a good thing. So it is dangerous to use exit in a program, and we prefer in general that you use return if at all possible. So Dr. Planck, whose notes these are, comes from a C background, and he sometimes uses exit. In general, I don't want you doing that if you can avoid it. I prefer return. Now, for the time being, if you're several functions deep, it can be inconvenient to have to return all the way to main to return. If you're several functions deep, I'm not going to quibble with you using exit. But if you're in main, please use return and don't use exit. Exit has some issues associated with it in C++. In C, it is a perfectly good way to escape from a program and terminate it, but not in C++. And we are using C++ in this course. Okay, you will note that Dr. Planck has a flamboyant writing style, which I enjoy. So here he is punned. And you all got familiar with CN when we were working in 102. What you did not get familiar with when we were working in 102 is what happens when CN encounters some erroneous input. So what I would like you to do is go back to your homework.cpp problem and using VI or Vim or whatever editor you plan to use, I'd like you to go into it and I would like you to get rid of the cout statement that's currently there. Now, who remembers how to delete a line in VI? Take man in orange there. DD. Yep, DD. So if you type DD, that will delete the line. If you type, say, NDD, say I typed 4 and then DD, that would delete 4 lines. Okay, so in general, if I type NDD, that's going to delete N lines. Whoops, just. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to declare a variable, an integer variable, and I want you to read something into that integer variable, and then I want you to print out that integer variable. Okay, so just something very simple like that. Please go ahead and compile it and try entering first a number to make sure it works. But then after you enter a number, what I'd like you to do is to enter something that's not a number, like your name. Okay, so if you do that, if I enter just a number, it should work, right? Can someone tell me what they get if they type in their name?
0.
You got 0, okay? What you, 0. Anyone get something not 0? What'd you get?
6.95314 e to the negative 310.
Okay, pretty big negative, almost 0, it turns out, but not quite. Anyone else not 0? Anyone? Everyone else got, how many people got 0? Wow, okay. That's pretty unusual. Let's see what I get. I got 0 too. Okay, so that is not guaranteed. It can be, yes.
I'm pretty good at Xcode
Pardon?
initialize into 0.
What does?
I think Xcode.
Okay, so Xcode on the Mac is initializing stuff to 0. Okay, so if you're running on Hydra machines, you cannot assume that. Okay, this is one of the biggest sources of errors we often get is the Hydra machines don't automatically initialize stuff to 0. Yes?
I'm using putty to get into the Hydra machine and I got a 0.
You can still get a 0, but it's less guaranteed. Okay, so the big point there is that something happened. It was not a integer that you entered. Okay, so it did not work properly. And what happened is it left whatever value was already there. Okay, so whatever value was already there, it left there. Okay, now what I want you to do is go back in, and after you have read the I want you to try to read in a value for j. So now what I want you to do is to go in, and after you read a value for I and print it, read a value for j and print it. Okay, and for your input, again, maybe choose your name, and then choose something valid like an integer. Choose a valid integer. So choose your first piece of input should be invalid, some kind of word. Your second piece should be valid. Okay, and compile that. Okay, and can someone tell me what they got for J? 0. Not 4, huh? Anyone else? All zeros, probably? Anyone else not? So if you do it, whoops, you can see doing this, and just a second, enter Brad. Okay, all I'm doing is entering Brad, right? Do we agree? Are we in agreement? I hit return, I never even got an opportunity to enter 4, right? That happened for you too? Okay. So, that's kind of odd, right? I mean, I didn't even get an opportunity to read a second value. So you may be trying to puzzle out what happened. Why didn't it ask me or wait for a second piece of input? Okay? Well, the first thing you might want to do, so this is important, which is thinking about when something like this happens. I'm not just going to tell you the answer. You also need to learn how to debug your programs. We didn't do this a lot in CS102, but as your programs become more complicated, you need to learn. Learning how to debug is an art, okay? So one thing we want to do is see whether it kind of got to that point where it was actually prompting or reading something for J. Okay, because it looked pretty strange. It never seemed to want a second value. So let's see if we can put in a prompt statement. Okay, for J to see whether we're even getting to this point in the program, because something seems weird here. So a good thing to do when you're not sure what's happening is to start putting some debug statements into your program. Okay, and if we run it and we enter Brad, okay, it did print out J equals question mark. So it did get to that point in the program. It printed out J equals question mark, so it sure looks like it got to the point where it was reading something for J, but it never stopped like it normally does. Normally it stops, right? And it pauses for us. Okay, if I enter a correct value, let's enter a correct value here. We'll enter 8. Now it stopped, right? It stopped. It's waiting for me. Okay, if I enter 10, it worked. But if I enter Brad, it's wrong. Okay, so it's a mystery. Okay, the answer to our mystery is this. Does anyone want to answer the mystery for me?
Scene fails.
It did fail, and when it fails, what happens?
You have to reset it, otherwise it can't read any more inputs.
That is correct. So once it fails, it's in what is called an error state. Okay? And you have to reset it. CN is broken. Basically, when you try to read something that it doesn't anticipate, it breaks. Okay? It's broken. So you have to fix it before you can continue. Okay? The way you fix it is by using cn.clear. Okay? So you can, I'm just going to right now clear it. So I'm assuming, by the way, that it's failed. We'll get to how we test for this in a moment. But right now, I'm going to assume that it failed. So cn.clear resets the stream. It fixes it. Okay, so cn.clear, it resets it, it fixes it. So if we compile it, we're going to try it again. It still doesn't work. Okay, I just seemingly lied to you. I said that if I add cn.clear, it fixes the problem. Well, not exactly. Okay, there's a two-step recovery process. We have the 12 steps for addiction. We have the 2 steps for CN. The first step, so if there's an error, if there is a CN error, there's a 2-step recovery process. Step 1 is that we call cn.clear. So that resets the state. Okay, from an error state back to a state that says you're willing to accept input. The second issue is that it doesn't consume that Brad. So we talk about stream input. Remember that from 102, that input is a stream of words or tokens? Well, when CN fails to read something into I, it does not consume that word. Instead, it leaves it on the input. So the problem is Brad is still lurking on the input. It's still stuck. So CN.clear fixes it. Think of me driving a car in the desert, okay? And I hit a bump, boom, and my axle breaks. As my axle breaks, not only, so I went over a bump, I landed hard on a sand dune. Boom, broke the axle. Okay, I fixed the axle. Try to get going, and my wheels are stuck. That's what's happened with CN. Not only do I have to fix it by saying CN.clear, but it's stuck on this input Brad. Brad is still sitting there. It hasn't been consumed. So we have to find a way to consume Brad. Okay, we have to clear it away. It's like the wreckage in a car wreck. We have to get rid of it. Okay? So the second thing we have to do is we have to somehow get rid of the bad input. And there's a surefire way to get rid of the bad input. Okay? Anyone have C++ experience and know how to get rid of that bad input? There's one kind of variable that will always successfully read something from standard in. A string variable. So what you can do is you can read the bad input into a string variable, and then you'll ignore it. Okay, yes.
Is there a way to do it without like putting it into like a loose variable that you're not going to use?
Not really.
Really?
Nope. At least not that I know of. Maybe if I went to stackoverflow.com I could find a way, but I've never bothered. I just read it into a string variable that I ignore.
That doesn't
Okay.
take up. That doesn't take up too much space.
It takes up 4 bytes or 8 bytes on a 64-bit machine. Memory's pretty cheap these days. If you were developing for an Android, for a mobile device, it might be a little bit more of an issue, but still not much of an issue. It's not a big deal. You shouldn't worry about it. Other questions? Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually flash ahead a bit and show you the code that actually works. Okay, so here's the code that actually works. Okay, it's a lot more complicated than, can you read this in the back? Okay, so it's a lot more complicated than the simple code that we've been writing. It should be clear that unfortunately, once you start checking for errors, your code blows up. That's why no programmer enjoys doing error checking. It's a total pain in the neck. The amount of code required to do error checking, as you can see, is voluminous and far exceeds it if you could just assume the input is correct. We have, what, about 10 lines, 12, 13 lines of code versus the 2 if we could just assume it was correct. In fact, we could just use 1, right? We could say Cn into I into J. So this is why programmers often skip this critical step. You know what happens when you skip the critical step of error checking? Hackers love you. Okay? This is one of the biggest ways that hackers burrow their ways into our computers. They take advantage of the fact that programmers are too lazy to do error checking or just forget. Okay, and when you forget, hackers are very clever and they're very patient and they will eventually worm their way in. So error checking is important. You often can't assume the input is correct. Now in our labs this semester, we will tell you whether it can be correct or incorrect. In general, if we don't tell you that the input is correct, you may have to do some checking. Okay, if you're in doubt, please post to Piazza so we can clarify for you. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. First of all, as I said, Dr. Planck uses these single variables. I am not a big fan, although in this case we're just doing some simple stuff. Nonetheless, I kind of would probably in my own program, rather than putting string S, would probably put something like, say, string garbage dump or something, just so that you realize that this string is not going to be used. So you can see that what we do is we do our read statement. If it succeeds, then it returns, well, we're not going to worry what it returns, but it returns something not false. If it does fail, it will return false. Okay? An error value, saying, or non-error value, it returns false. So if it succeeds, we're going to print out what I is. Okay? But if I is not an integer, it will fail. Okay? In 102, Cn could fail. Why would Cn fail in 102? End of file. Okay? So we taught you in 102 that Cn could fail because of end of file. Here it can also fail because you don't read in the proper value. So in this case, we have to print out the fact that it failed. Anyone notice something odd about how we print? Printf. So I shouldn't use the royal we, I, Dr. Planck, most people who use C++ hate cout once they have to do formatted output. Okay? Here you're not really doing formatted output. He's just introducing it. So we will get to printf in a moment. Hopefully you read the notes for today so this doesn't totally surprise you because printf was included in the second set of notes for today. So printf is simply saying print formatted output. And you can see there's not really any formatting here. We could have done it easily with cout. But it's just printing out the fact that it was a bad CN, or bad CN call. And now we have our two-step recovery process. So step 1, we clear it. Step 2, we discard the bad input. Now, in a real program, if we want it to continue, we would probably put this in a loop because we would want to keep going until we actually read a legitimate value for I. Okay? But in this case, we're just going to keep going. So now we repeat the process for J. And we also read in a value. And if it succeeds, we print it. And if not, we clear it. We read the value into S. And you see that we never do anything with it. If I wanted to, I could print it out, but there's no real reason to. Now, I just said in a real program, you would probably write a loop in order to make this work. So, in fact, that's what I would like you to do right now. So I would like you to take a few minutes. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. Feel free to work with a friend or a couple friends on this. If you don't have a laptop, please get out some paper and pencil and try to do it yourself. Copy just the top part of this program. And what I want you to do is I want you to keep prompting the user for input. So actually add a prompt that asks for the value of I. And what I want you to do is modify this code so that it keeps prompting the user for I until it gets a legitimate integer. So when it gets a legitimate integer, I want you to print out the value of that integer. Until you get that legitimate integer, so as long as the user keeps entering bad input, I want you to keep looping and prompting the user for another integer. Is that clear? Everyone know what your task is? Okay. Like I said, feel free to work with a neighbor or two. And I'm giving you 5 minutes to about 10:25. If you have a question, raise your hand. Alan and I will be around to help. If you're having any other problems right now too, you may want to just raise your hand and we can help.
So the nice thing about do while is it'll always run things first. So like we want to run this at least once. So that's why it's an end here. So you can say do keep right at the beginning. Like after int main, after you basically right before you add a prompt, you would put a do and then open curly bracket, and then you would let everything at the very top end in curly bracket, and then at the bottom while, and then
No, this isn't
try, because it's do while this is an int. Let's make it while check. While go. What do you need garbage? Another like the string? Yeah. Put it as if, and then if CN went to garbage. CN input went to garbage. So if something was in the case of the total beside that, there's press A, include C as that's the
using macOS 10.8 or earlier. Okay, cool.
I might not see it now. It's I just didn't like the programming class. So I just like to tell it just like run it just wants it to like so what you have right now is if you enter something that's not an integer, it'll store it to your string, and then it'll print out bad CN. But right now your program will end, so he wants it to rerun your program until the user enters it. So like don't let the program end until you get a valid data type in I. So you're just do right here. And then do this is what you're wanting to do. And you're wanting to repeat this until this is all of it. Up to the return. You don't want to exit. Things kind of slow. Yeah, exactly. And then you want to do while but I don't know what this is. Questions? Well, run it. I think you need to do while. I would just do while. Yeah, I would just do while. Double here because we'll see it. See if that works. But if you put this at the beginning, it's never going to come. What, you know what is this?
It's just like while
So you're gonna keep.
I was looking at this.
So how are you ever gonna move into like it's gonna always prompt the user this. It's always gonna sit in a prompt. Once you have one input, so just do a do while. Well, it's not. How it's not. Yeah, but I still don't know how to use it. It's like it's do right with the if up there.
Yeah.
So do what he has highlighted. Am I flagging while you have valid typation? That word.
You know what I'll do is?
Oh, I forgot to tell you. I use it.
Fortunately, yeah, I gotta get rid of. Well, that's my bad. That I need to get rid. I'll fix that. Yeah, need it. So the flag part is. I think Clang works too. It's Pardon?
Doing what I tried, it says using this kind of behavior is depreciated.
Deprecated.
It
Sorry.
And it just doesn't like it when you use Clang.
I think because Clang may be the C compiler,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure why. I mean, we tried. G++ on the Macs is apparently alias to Clang. You should get in the habit of using G++. Right. It's the same on the Mac. When you do G++, it's really Clang. It's alias to it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. So there's a library you have to. It is, I believe, C. I'm going to really lie. C standard lib, I believe.
No, it's standard.
So Dr. Planck's note says C standard lib. I always say standard IO.8. But the notes say C standard lib, I believe. What?
It's C standard lib. Specifically.
Oh, I have an idea. That one does work. I was gonna say initialize S, and then you check if S equals what your initial value was. But that would only not work if they choose to set S to be whatever your initial value is.
So
I'm trying to stop once you get the same answer.
here's a cute thing. Yeah, you use the back file.
Other than initial factors.
Well, that's why you experiment. Now try IO, standard IO.8. Yeah. And that will work. Yep, .8. Okay, if you're having difficulty with printf not working, you will need another include command. It is standard io.h. So that if you're having trouble with printf not showing up, then this will solve your problem.
The more proper way would be C standard IO.
Okay, or thank you, that was what I was not getting. So probably better STDIO. Okay, use that. Sorry, don't use the first one. That's more of a C idiom. Use # include CSTDIO. Okay, and that should take care of that issue.
And Mac users, if you're using text edit to do copying and pasting from the web, because sometimes things happen weird when you try to paste directly into GI, that's a good idea. Just make sure that text edit is set to plain text mode, or you'll get all the crazy HTML stuff.
That we may have to post a Piazza post about how you set it to text edit mode. Okay, let's tackle this now and talk about how to write the code. So first thing is, what kind of loop is probably best for this particular task? Okay, while loop will work. I might have chosen a do while, but we'll do a while loop. The reason I might suggest a do while is because you have to read it at least once, right? So we'll do it both ways. So let's do, I'm using a Mac, so I'm going to do a copy and paste. So I'm going to create a Okay, so we start with this, and we are instead going to try to write a loop to keep doing it. So one way that we can do it, I guess I did not shoot, except I'm going to use something that I didn't talk about yet. That's so nice. Let's see. This is unfortunate. Okay. Okay, unfortunately, I don't want to show you a kludgy way to do it. So I'm going to do it the way that is the right... Come on, what the heck's happening here? Okay, what is happening? Oh, my fingers are on the wrong key. Okay, so we are going to start by reading this thing into I. Okay? Now, this is the part I should have gone over, which is there is something called cin.fail. Which is way down. Does he not have it? Good Lord. Ah, there we go. cin.fail. Okay, so cin.fail tells you whether or not the stream is broken. Okay? So what I'm going to do is say while cin.fail. So that means that the stream is broken if we had an error input. So I'm just going to say, actually up here I had cout I equals, and I'll just re-echo it. Cout I equals, and I'll read I. Now, someone's got to tell me why this is wrong. Just a moment. Let me So we prompt, we read. If we fail, we prompt, we read. What's wrong? I'll start with.
CN not there.
Okay, we need to do cn.clear. That going to fix it?
No, we need to read
Nope.
the string.
What else do I need?
String.
So I also need to unstick myself by reading that input. Okay, so now I've read the bad input, I've cleared it, and I now print I equals prompt, read it, it should work. Okay, first I'm going to make sure that this works. Okay, it worked, so that's the way to convert it to a loop. I'm sorry, I'd forgotten about fail and having to tell you about that. So fail tells you whether or not CN is broken. Okay, and there's two reasons you might have failure. One is EOF, and two is because you tried to read some bad input. Okay, so questions about that. Another thing, the order of operations is important. It's important that you do the clear first and the consumption second. Okay? You got to fix it before you can unstick it. If you try it this way, it shouldn't work. The reason is when you try to read into S, it's still broken. And so it won't actually work. You first have to clear it, then read. Okay, so that order is important. So questions? Yes.
So you said this was better than the other method, and I'm assuming you're talking about instead of doing, I guess, so the way I wrote it was instead of using while cn.fail, I said while not cn inputs to I.
Okay, so you said while not CN to I. Ah, that's a very nice solution, yes. CN.clear, CN, Cout. That works fine too.
I think you just need to do with the last CN.
Okay, CN.clear. Yes, and then I don't need that. Yep, and I need this still up here. Okay. Yep, that would work too. Okay, in fact, that is probably a more elegant solution. Okay, now, there is a problem with both my solution and this solution potentially. Subtle. But this isn't completely correct. Okay? It may not be obvious, but let's compile. Enter Brad, enter Tony, enter Charlie, enter Mary, enter Sue. I'm getting tired. I don't know what the heck I'm doing wrong. Control D. So the way you terminate input in a command line editor on a Mac is Control D, and Alan, is it also Control D in Windows, or is it Control?
I don't know, I've been using Windows for about a week, so.
Okay.
Control D and Windows.
I think it's
Control C?
Control Z, I think.
Control Z? Okay, in Windows it's Control Z. So I'm tired, I don't know what the heck I'm doing wrong, because my error message stinks. Okay, that's one thing when you do have an error. It typically helps to tell the person what the problem is, which is it would be a lot better to say that I is not an integer, please enter an integer. So I'm frustrated, I can't figure out what's going on, I hit Control D, oh my gosh! Whoa! Let's try it again. Brad, Tony, Mary. Well, at any rate, there's clearly something wrong. Okay, I didn't quite expect that. I didn't expect the endless loop of death. Ah, now I understand why the endless loop of death is there. Okay, so what happened? Actually, that endless loop of death should have happened for some of you as well. Okay, what went wrong? I never provided it with proper input, okay? So this always failed, always, okay? So it kept coming back and it prompting for I equals question mark. Now, I eventually terminated the input by hitting Control D. Okay, that terminated the input. However, that meant that CN kept failing. Okay, CN kept trying, was very persistent. It kept trying to read into I. Now there was no more input, but I never gave it an out. I never said if we reach the end of the input, we need to get out of here. Instead, I said, by gosh, you got to keep going at it till you succeed. But when I hit Control D and terminated the input, I made it impossible to succeed. So the computer did the equivalent of banging its head against the wall until I told it to stop by terminating the program. Okay, that's another important thing actually you have to learn, which is how to stop a runaway program. Okay, this was a runaway program. Whoops, just a second. That's a runaway program. It is important to know how to stop a runaway program. Okay, on a Mac, a runaway program can be stopped with Control C. Okay, now, that doesn't always stop it immediately because sometimes there is input queued up or the like and it takes a while, but Control C will ultimately stop it. I believe it's Control C on Windows too. Okay, we'll stop it as, pardon, right. Except that I think Control Z is required to stop, is required to give end of input on Windows.
Yeah, but they'll be in, even then, they'll be
Maybe. I'm not sure either. This is what happens when you get instructors who use Macintoshes and not Windows. Okay. Okay. At any rate, Control C will stop your program on both Windows and a Mac and on a Linux box. This is important because I guarantee you, you will have runaway programs. Okay, does everyone understand the problem we're facing here? Which is, I did not account for the fact that we might hit the end of file. So, yes?
I'm sorry, I just want to say that Control Z actually turns your process into a zombie process. So it still runs on the background. It gives you the...
Ooh, so you are running Unix, because Control Z on Unix sends it into the background. So, interesting. So it may be Control D as well. Okay, you're on a Windows box?
No,
You're on a Mac. The problem is, yes, okay, what I'm trying to do is distinguish between Mac boxes and Windows boxes. If you're in a Unix environment, you're right, Control Z will put you into the background. It's not a zombie process, it's actually running but in the background. So, but I will figure out how to stop it on Windows, but typically on Windows you stop you terminate your input with Control Z. I'm going to have to investigate what happens with Sigwin, okay? On a Mac and on Unix, you terminate with Control D, and you're right. In a Unix environment, Control Z will put it into the background. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Control C closes the process on Windows.
Control Z closes the Control C, right, closes the process. I was talking Z as in Z, okay? But yes, Control C will stop it on both the Mac and Windows. Okay. Now we want to get rid of, we want to handle the case where we get EOF. Okay? So we can add a second condition, and not cin.eof. Oh, I hate cin.eof. It causes more issues than anything, but here we have to use it. So the first thing says we're going to keep going if cin fails. The second thing gives us an out if we reach end of file. So we're going to continue in our loop if cin fails and the failure is not due to EOF. If the failure is due to EOF, we're going to get out of there. Okay? So this kind of fixes it, right? We'll see. Brad, Tony, Sue. Okay, the only issue, what's the only issue? Well, it wasn't so much the prompt, it's the fact that I still printed I as 0, which isn't really true. Okay, so we might have to, in this case, print out something like we never got a valid value. So we might want to say, if, say, cin.fail, we might want to say something like, we never got a valid value, or make it more personal, you never entered a valid value for I.
Didn't you say 0 is the initialization of I?
No. Ooh, you need to get that out of your heads. There is, what we said was that Xcode chooses on a Mac to initialize your value to 0, and that you cannot assume that your C++ implementation, I'm not sure who asked it, you cannot assume that the C++ implementation will set it to 0. Okay, it's not in the standard.
But that's
So
where the 0 is coming from?
that's where the 0 is coming from on Macs. Okay? But they're on Hydra. You may get a 0, you may not, because as far as I know, on Hydras, at least in up until last year for sure, it did not set your value to 0. It left it to whatever was there before. Okay? So you cannot assume that it gets initialized to 0.
The reason I ask is just because you could initialize I as you never entered a valid value for I.
True, you could, but the problem is if so I could initialize it here, but what value can I enter that's an invalid integer, right? There's no, you might say, okay, well, why not set it to 0? And that way, if at the end it's 0, I know it's invalid. But the problem is, what if the user entered 0? So you're right, sometimes it's possible to set I to an invalid value, but in this case, there's no possible invalid value I can set it to. Okay? I could certainly initialize it explicitly to 0, but 0 is a valid value, so I can't rely on that. Yes?
I pretty much had the same code as you, but I'm not sure if my inputs are right. I'm getting really weird error messages.
Let me look at it after class, okay?
I can't compile it. So.
Let me look after class. Okay, but this is guaranteed to work. So if we failed, then you never entered a valid value for I, else we output the proper value, and all is good. Okay? Yes?
Is there any time when you should use printf instead of cout?
Okay, question was, is there ever a time when you should use printf rather than cout? I don't care. Okay, sorry. This is religion. It doesn't matter. No. The answer is no. Printf and cout are interchangeable. Just be consistent. I know we weren't consistent here. But in general, settle on one or the other. Generally, you're going to settle on printf because you're going to find it's less cumbersome for producing formatted output. But if you just really have a crush on cout, knock yourself out. Okay? Yes.
That the if cin dot fail makes me a little bit nervous because
You could say if cin.eof, but
okay, because I guess it's because since we're turning the input, I'm not sure with the while loop. Like if we terminate the input, how does that affect the while loop that's looking for input?
so when we
Where do
terminate the
stop?
input, it's going to wait until it does the next read. Okay? And then it will see, when you do cin, that the input is terminated. So it doesn't matter where it is in the execution of the while loop when you hit Control D. It will ignore anything you enter until the next time it executes cin. Let's get this after class. I have to finish up. Okay? So, bottom line, in this class, we're going to be often asking you to check for error values. You need to become familiar with checking for error values. So cin.fail is a way to check to see whether cin failed. Cin.eof is a way to check to see whether you've reached the end of file. It is a nice idiom. This one will also tell you whether cin failed or not. But if you need to know after the fact, okay, so this gives it to you in the moment, but like down here, I need it to know after the fact whether it failed or not. I can use the fail command. And you may sometimes need to know whether it failed because you reached EOF or because you failed because it was bad input. So EOF tells you whether you failed because you reached the end of the file or not. Now, please do read Dr. Planck's 4 common errors. Okay? I don't want to, I'm just going to quickly go through them. The first one is make sure you put parentheses. Whoops. Make sure that you parenthesize properly. Notice here, if you're going to say if not, cin into, you have to put the exclamation mark outside the parentheses. If you put it inside the parentheses, bad things happen. Okay? So it turns out that there's an order of operations, and the bang sign binds more tightly to cin than it does to the expression cin greater than n1. Okay? So make sure that you put the actual read expression in parentheses and you put the bang sign outside of it. That's big error number 1. Okay, big error number 2, the most common problem, is thinking that cin.eof is proactive. It's not. It's reactive. Okay? So it does not tell you, it's not able to look into the future and tell you whether or not you have reached end of file. It's only able to tell that to you after it has reached end of file. So here's a common error that beginners make. They think, wow, I love cin.eof, so I want to read until I reach the end of the file. So they put, while not cin.eof, I will add 1 to the amount of input. I will read the value into my string, and I'll print out whatever the value of the string is. Okay? So you enter 11 and 22 as your input, and your output is string 1 is 11, string 2 is 22, oops, string 3 is 22. Yet we only entered 11 and 22. What happened? Well, what happened is you thought Cn was proactive. You thought that what would happen is it would read 11 and print it out. Then you thought it would go through and say, oh, we're not at EOF. Okay, we'll read 22 and we'll print it out. And then you thought it would get here and it would magically know that it reached the end of file, that there was no input, and it would exit. No, it doesn't know that because it's not proactive. It has not yet attempted to read the next string. So it says, no, I haven't reached end of file. It goes in one more time, increments I, tries to read the input. Whoops, I failed, didn't work. When it doesn't work, it leaves the old value in S, which was 22. So it prints it out a second time, which is wrong. Okay? You can avoid this problem either by using our idiom that we gave you in 102, or you can go over this code yourself, which I don't particularly care for. Not that it's good code, it's just I think it's more problem prone. Okay, this is perfectly acceptable code on the left. I just think you're more likely to run into errors if you use it. So don't get into the trap of thinking that EOF is proactive. Okay, Cn reads words, it doesn't read lines. I didn't see this issue a whole lot in 102. Okay, again, make sure when Cn fails you first clear it. Second, you unstick it by consuming the bad piece of input. You do that by reading it into S. Okay? Next time we will go into printf. We're not behind. I thought we would move a little faster, but we will talk about printf next time. We may also get into some topcoder next time.